So first of all, Anna, let me start with you. Anna Greka is an institute member at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. I think you all know, it's probably one of the most pioneering research institutes in its field in the world. Through the Greka lab, which she's created, she leads a program aimed at dissecting the mechanisms of disease and identifying novel therapeutic targets in genetically defined kidney, metabolic, and degenerative disorders. And you probably have seen her TED Talk and some of her breakthrough pioneering papers. We're very excited about some of the work that Anna's doing. But Anna, why don't you give us at least a short primer on what you're really doing and what you're excited about?
Sure. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, James, and to all of you for being with you for the last couple of days. It's been incredible. So I'm a physician scientist and a cell biologist, a researcher. I work in the lab. One way in which I would describe what we do in the lab is sleuthing, molecular sleuthing, we call it. And that's really solving biological mysteries, right? We are grounded very much on understanding how misspellings in the DNA result in broken circuits inside cells. These are our units of life, essentially. And then we try to understand how these broken mechanisms lead to disease. And then, of course, the reason for that is to find ways to reverse that. And so historically, the way that my field has proceeded was to actually do what I call hand-to-hand combat. A group of scientists like my own, picks a misspelling that they're going to work on, and then we spend several years trying to understand those mechanisms in the hopes of building a therapy. And while we have been successful a few times in doing that, if you actually take a step back and look at the magnitude of the problem, we have a lot of work to do. So I'll just share a brief story that sort of illustrates what I'm talking about and how my eyes were open to the opportunities that lie ahead and how that has shaped my vision for how we can use AI and modern tools to really accelerate what I have been doing. So about 20 years ago on the island of Cyprus, it was discovered that there was a genetic mutation, a misspelling in the DNA that ran into every generation of these families. And everybody, ultimately, 50% of people in each generation in these families died of kidney disease. It took 20 years, 25 years, and the best geneticists all around the world, and no one could solve this puzzle. What was the causal misspelling that caused this disease? And it took the incredible firepower of my colleagues at the Broad Institute to actually solve this puzzle. We found the specific misspelling. It was hiding in a dark corner of a gene. Details don't matter. But once we cracked that problem, then the next question was, well, how does this lead to disease? So my team took over, and we did a lot of work, which I don't have time to describe. But needless to say, through doing that work, we actually uncovered something a lot bigger than just solving the problem of this disease, which we did. We actually uncovered that the cause, the circuit inside the cells that is broken, is actually not unique to this genetic misspelling, but it actually is a nodal mechanism that actually is the broken circuit in many other diseases that no one would have predicted would be linked to one another. So we cracked open this nodal pathway in kidney disease and then realized that it can actually solve a form of blindness called retinitis pigmentosa. It can solve some forms of Alzheimer's disease. My group is now working in the eye, in the brain, in the liver, in ways that no one would have predicted before. So then, of course, we thought, well, this can't be the only example in which this is the case. And now we step back and think about the magnitude of the problem. There are 8,000 such misspellings in genes, in our genomes, that cause these diseases that are caused by a misspelling in a single particular gene. And then, of course, there are many other diseases where multiple genes conspire to cause trouble, like schizophrenia or cancer or heart disease. So how can we begin to unravel these mysteries? Hand-to-hand combat is not going to do it, right? And so this is where now this incredible set of tools that we have uncovered can come in, and not only associations, but also doing finding causal relationships. So I do real experiments in the lab. We can run these at scale. In the past 5 years, my team has generated 50 million images containing information from more than 100 billion cells. We can continue to do that so that we can train our models to be much more predictive. And so we can actually use now causal inference to be able to actually understand how many of these misspellings bind together into groups that can be served by these nodal pathways, that can be served by specific treatments, so that we can actually go ahead and find treatments in parallel. We call this massively parallel sleuthing, if you will, to solve many more diseases at the same time rather than sequentially over long periods of time. That's what I'm most excited about.
So is that the essence of how AI has been game-changing? This idea you no longer have to go, problem by problem, but actually tackle a lot of them?
Absolutely. So in understanding these 50 million images that we generated, we definitely used like classical machine learning approaches, and of course we had to do all of that. But now that our LLMs are getting better and our image analysis can get better, we can do more advanced things that actually allow us to process even larger sets of data. And then I think that will ultimately be able to help us find these sort of nodal pathways that we're after. So it can be very game-changing.
Yeah, I've been struck, for example, by the...
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been struck by one of your colleagues, Feng Chang, and
Yes.
all of you have been using, for example, AlphaFold as a way to, I think he developed this really novel molecular syringe that actually helps kind of, deliver drugs to the right place, to the right spot. I think it's breathtaking stuff. Now, Sal, remind me again, when did you found Khan Academy?
It depends. 2004, I started tutoring cousins. 2005, I started writing software for them, and that was the first Khan Academy. 2006, I started making YouTube videos for my family, and people who weren't my cousins started watching. And 2008, I set it up as a not-for-profit, mission-free, world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And then 2009, I quit my hedge fund job to work on it full-time.
That's quite a journey. But I was struck in your recent TED Talk. I think you said something like, AI will save, not destroy education. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and a big belief even beyond education is it's not like we're just going to be passive observers and see what AI happens. It's really all of us in the room and beyond to decide whether AI is going to save or destroy us in any one domain. But education, as I just mentioned, I started tutoring my cousins, and I used to always say that when I introduced Khan Academies, just the quirky way that we got started. But I realized that the whole arc of everything I've been doing from 2004 has been trying to scale myself or ourselves as tutors. It's always been known that the gold standard in education, Alexander the Great had Aristotle as his personal tutor.
I like that.
Why is that better than the 30-to-1 ratio? Well, if Alexander really got military tactics well, Aristotle would move ahead. If Alexander was a little bit weak on taxation or accounting or whatever, Aristotle would slow down. 200-300 years ago, we had to make a compromise. We had this utopian idea, free mass public education. No coincidence that the first societies to adopt it were the first to actually become developed, have a middle class, but we had to make compromises. We're going to batch kids together, 30 at a time, usually by age, sometimes age and perceived ability, move them all together at a set pace. And some kids are going to, lecture, homework. Some kids will do well on the test. Some kids will get 80%, 60%. Even though those gaps are identified, you just keep on moving, and at some point you hit a wall. And many of us always had the luxury, either we could step in, tutor our family ourselves, as I did with my cousins, or we could hire tutors. But what we've been trying to do over the years is, okay, we can't, I thought at the time, in 2004, 2009, we can't give everyone a personal tutor, but what if we could give them personalized practice so they can learn at their own time and pace, get immediate feedback? What if they do have human beings in their life, they have parents and they have teachers, what if we could inform the teachers where all their students are so that even though they have 30 kids to deal with, they can personalize it even more? What if with on-demand video, you can at least get the explanation when you want it, pause, repeat. You don't have to be embarrassed that you're reviewing something from a few grade levels before. And so a lot of what we've done over Khan Academy over the years is trying to make that better and better and better. And what's been fascinating about this past year is a realization that, I think all of that stuff is still going to be very valuable. Even a personal tutor needs something to anchor on, needs a textbook, needs a curriculum, needs other resources. But I think we're at the cusp of actually being able to emulate a lot what I was able to literally do for my cousins.
Well, you've actually built this, right? Do you want to describe that for us very quickly?
Yeah, we started working on it about a year ago. I was skeptical of gender. I always thought it was cool, but I thought it was a toy until about a year ago. And when we saw what, now the latest frontier models are capable of doing, that's when I was like, okay, this changes literally everything. And half of Khan Academy, it's much more than me now. We're 250 people all over the world. We're in 50-plus languages. Half of our team was like, we got to go all in on this. And then half of our team is like, we have to have nothing to do with this whatsoever. This stuff can hallucinate. It's infamously bad at math. our credibility is around solid knowledge, world-class education. We can't have something that's just hallucinating and making up things. And these are kids on top of, and even younger than 13, we're talking about working with. But I told the team, like, it's just a matter of time. We have got to lead all of these fears. We have to turn them into features. And so, for example, the biggest fear that was obvious when we first saw this is cheating. We say, okay, our application that leverages generative AI, it's called Conmigo. It will not cheat. It's Socratic. But it leads to the question, well, what about going to ChatGPT and using or cheating that way? And we think, and by the way, even before generative AI, you could go on the internet and pay people $10 a page to get your essay written, which is also completely undetectable by plagiarism detector. So this problem has been around for a while. But we think actually this opens up into saving education, that the AI doesn't write for you, but it writes with you. And it will support you like an ethical coach would. And then the teacher assigns through the AI, AI reports back, and then the teacher gets a report not just on the final output, but on the whole process. The AI tells them, yeah, we worked for 4 hours, we had trouble with the thesis statement, and if a student just copies and pastes from ChatGPT or pays someone on the internet to write the essay, the AI tells the teacher, I don't know where this essay came from, it looks kind of shady. You might want to look at it.
I like that. But we'll come back to some of these points. But let me introduce my colleague, Yossi Matias. So Yossi is the Vice President of Engineering Research at Google. He's been at Google for a long time, led a lot of pioneering research on a whole range of things. But I want to focus on some of the work you've been doing, particularly around climate and also around crises and how we think about, and also around health. But talk a little bit about some of the moonshots and things you've been doing, and then we'll have a wider conversation.
Oh, sure. Thanks, James, and thanks everyone here. So as James mentioned, I was at Google for many years and actually on the search leadership for over a decade. Now, let me focus on one example that I think is very illustrative and meaningful about both the power of AI and how it's also helping solve societal problems. So with climate crisis, of course, now we say an intensification and more frequency of natural disasters, floods, wildfires, others. But these are not new. In fact, 6 years ago, we already observed that floods, which is one of the most devastating natural disasters, killing thousands of people every year and impacting hundreds of millions and tens of billions of dollars in economic damage. And people are relying on Google for information. That's our mission. But there was no really helpful information out there to help people, because to be helpful, you need to warn people ahead of time so they can take action. So I actually looked into the problem, if there's anything we can do about it, and the general consensus was that not much, because the state of the art of how to predict floods was that it's a tough problem. There are many variables: the lay of the land, precipitation, the soil, what's happening where the water is going there, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of research, and but it was very difficult to actually get predictions. But we thought, well, let's try to see if we can do anything about it anyway, because if we can, that could save lives. So it was a moonshot, which, by the way, I didn't give it much chance, but I thought this is important enough to try. And so I asked actually a small team to look into what can we do with machine learning and cloud computing and of course, research. And a few months later, actually, we saw that we can actually make some progress. And we actually hypothesized that with machine learning, we could actually try to solve the problem. Actually published a paper in 2018 with this hypothesis. And then we set up a small pilot in India, in Patna, which is one of the areas that are prone to floods. And we set a small pilot to see if we can do anything about it, and it was actually quite successful. So next time, we actually expanded it times 10, and a couple of years later, we already covered all of India and Bangladesh, and a couple of years ago, already sent out 115 million notifications to people at risk. Now, importantly, in order to be effective, you really need to be very accurate, because you can't just warn people if it's not reliable. People cannot take action, evacuation is expensive, especially in developing countries, which are actually on the receiving end of many of these disasters. But then we also hit another question, which is, okay, but how can we scale it further? Because there's a lot of work for every country, for every model. And that's actually where we set up working with academia, with many experts around the world, And we took another kind of moonshot, if you will, which is to build what we call a global hydrologic model.
So you actually build a world model for floods.
A world model for hydrology, which brings together all the experience, all the historical data that is publicly available, training machine models on that, and be able to then predict floods, even in places that you don't have historical data, just by actually transfer learning, as we call it, from one area to the other. And we put all this information in what we call Flood Hub, and announced a few months ago that we now cover 80 countries with 460 million people. And just yesterday, I was in Brussels to announce in an event that we are now covering also US and Canada. So what you see here is really Flood Hub, and every dot is a place that we have a prediction that is analyzed to be accurate enough to actually be helpful. Green means that no reason to worry. But for example, on the red dots, you see there in Africa, and purple is even worse, and a few in South America. Those are actually high-risk areas because the water level is expected. And just in August, for example, in Chile, there were actually devastating floods. And on TV, they actually showed these predictions, and then people could actually evacuate in time and take action to save themselves. So this was actually, that's an example where AI took a problem that seemed impossible, and actually now we solved it partially, at least, for a pretty big part of the world.
Yeah, you know, one thing that's always stayed with me on this work is the fact that I think there's a UN published data that shows that, you know, in low-income countries or even poor communities in advanced economies, giving people an extra week of notice as opposed to one day, you can save as much as 49% of the potential casualties. I think that's extraordinary. But I'll come back to you, Yossi, on another topic that I think you're pretty passionate about. But maybe a question for each of you. I mean, one of the things, as ambitious and as exciting as the things you're talking about, there are always a sense of perceived risks. I mean, Anna, in biology, in the life sciences, people worry about, you know, bioterrorism, all these things. People worry about privacy and data privacy. And how do you think about balancing the incredible, useful things you can do, but also those real concerns?
I think it's fair to say that these are fair concerns, and we have to take a balanced approach. I think it's impossible to not take the steps forward because it's just too exciting, too tantalizing to not try to advance. But with some guardrails and safeguards and maybe the mindfulness of what the risks could be. So, you know, you take AlphaFold, for example, and, you know, you can say, okay, a genetic misspelling causes this protein, which is the result of that misspelled gene, to kink in just this way that actually causes disease. It's deformed or misshapen in this way. Well, someone could take that information and turn a toxin into a worse toxin, or, you know, can turn a virus into a worse virus by taking a similar approach. So that's the risk, you know, just to describe it. Of course, there's always going to be the concern for bad actors. And I wish I had the precise answer for how we can, you know, make sure we safeguard from that. But I do think that we just have to be mindful in the responsible use of these tools. But, you know, with the prospect of helping people out there, you know, I always say to my team and to everyone who will listen, patients are waiting, and we're all future patients. You know, this is how this works. And so, you know, how can we stop? And so it's just a matter of sort of responsible use of the tools. But
yeah, no. I think certainly in the case of AlphaFold, I mean, one of the things we've tried to do when we first published, or at least made available the data sets for all the 200 million proteins known to science, first of all, we made them available to everybody, to researchers, your teams and others around the world. I think so far now we have something like 1.3 million biologists who are accessing this.
Including us.
including colleagues and researchers at the Broad, which has been great because it's given the possibility that neglected diseases can actually be looked at. But at the same time, we've not kind of opened up the underlying model, but we're thinking our way through that as to, you know, what's the right thing to do. But for now, that's kind of the conclusion we've reached on that work, as a way to at least try to mitigate some of those.
Yes, that's exactly right. For, you know, we make all of our data open access as well. But, you know, for example, when it comes to human genomic information, you know, we are we have guardrails around that. So a person cannot download any given person's genome who has donated that genome for research. So that information remains within people who have password access to that specific sort of underlying information. But the sort of the aggregate information from many genomes, for example, we have sequenced about 150,000 genomes and have made them publicly available at the Broad in aggregate data, so that researchers around the world can go and check if their gene of interest has a particular misspelling in an area that they're interested in. That's okay, but again, for the same thing, for privacy, for creating certain safeguards, and I think we just have to continue to be mindful of these things.
So Sal, you talked a lot about how this benefits the learner, the student, and in this kind of Socratic, don't give me the answer, but help me think my way through the problem. How does this be helpful to teachers?
Yeah, teachers spend 10, 15 hours a week doing things like writing lesson plans, grading papers, writing progress reports, and it's not work that they enjoy doing. A lot of teachers are already taking off-the-shelf systems to start doing that stuff for them. We've articulated Conmigo not only a tutor for the student, but it's a teaching assistant. And it's, once again, some of the fears, some of the risks have actually become features for the teacher. So there's some baseline, it won't cheat. We have a second AI that's moderating. If any of the conversations go into a shady place, it'll actively notify parents and teachers. But now, the old way of a teacher keeping track of what students were doing is either looking over their shoulder or seeing a dashboard of some kind. Now they can have a conversation. A TA and the tutor can be the same entity, where you're like, well, what have you been working with my students on? And it can, and we've actually already launched the first version of it. So we're trying this in real classrooms in places like Hobart, Indiana, and Newark, New Jersey, where the teachers are having conversations with the AI about what it's doing with the students and saying, yeah, overall, your students are getting this. Some kids have a misconception on photosynthesis. I had to be a simulation of Zeus because one kid was into Greek mythology. And so it gives them a much better lens. And yes, it helps them with the lesson planning, the grading papers, the progress reports. Takes that 15 hours closer to sub 1 hour.
Right. Well, one of the, just to go on a small tangent, Yossi, one of the projects you've been working on that I've been very excited about is Project Greenlight. Do you want to describe that?
Oh, sure. So for context, obviously, with floods and wildfires and other efforts, this is about what we call climate adaptation. How do we adapt to the climate crisis? But obviously, the big problem ahead of us is really the actual climate crisis of global warming, and things are not going well, as we know, in terms of the projections. So I think AI has the role and potential to also help out with that, and particularly about how do we slow down the climate change with what we call climate mitigation, namely technologies to reduce the carbon emission. So to that end, actually, I asked the team to look into ideas that could actually work with that, and literally examining dozens of ideas. And the one that actually came to the top in terms of its potential impact, which actually came about in one of our engineers' conversation over dinner with his wife, and he's now leading the project, is called Greenlight. So the observation is that a lot of the carbon emission is, of course, transportation. A lot of it is actually within the cities, and in fact, within intersections. It turns out that intersections within cities have times 29 the carbon emission of open roads. And much of the carbon emission is actually by cars that are stopping and going. So this is not only irritating for us as drivers, it's actually have big impact on climate. And the question was, can we do better? And Greenlight is a project that essentially takes data that we already have aggregated about traffic patterns for those not taking the train, and trying to analyze, can we do better in the light scheduling so as to reduce the number of stop and go? And it turns out that just by analyzing the data and applying AI, and also applying not only in a single intersection, but also looking into corridors, how can we have green lights between corridors, we can actually reduce the number of, by a factor of 30, which has impact of 10% in the areas in places that we tried. And we already had live pilots in 12 cities around the world, anything from Seattle to Rio de Janeiro to Haifa to Jakarta. And we have 30 million cars that are actually impacted by that per month. So if you really multiply by the number of intersections in the world, and the impact that this can have can have real impact on the emission. And importantly, this is not about installation of any sensors. It actually takes less than 5 minutes for a traffic engineer of a city to make the change that would actually get this 10% reduction of carbon emission. And one of the lessons here to me is that, wow, you have a system, everybody's still doing their stuff, and we could actually change materially how much carbon emission we have just by using AI and innovation, because there was an observation here.
No, I love this example. By the way, we should, if people have questions in the audience, please come in and go to the mics and raise questions. I was going to bring up one other example that I like, which is, I don't know if you've seen some of this work we've been doing on contrails, which is fascinating. So it turns out that, for example, in aviation, something like 35% of the actual warming that results from aviation is a result of these contrail effects. When planes fly and they create contrails create these particular kinds of cirrus clouds, which also then creates a bit of a canopy that raises basically warming. And that's as much as 35% of the aviation effect. So our teams and Yossi's team and others were trying to figure out, is there a way to actually predict flight patterns that actually avoid the creation of contrails? And it turns out you can. So we've been running these flight tests with American Airlines. I think we ran over 90 of them to figure out, does this actually work? And it turns out it actually does. In fact, reduces the contrail effect by as much as 54%, which I thought was breathtaking.
And just yesterday we announced actually in Brussels in the same event that we now actually partner with Eurocontrol so that they can actually notify pilots about recommended altitude to change so as to reduce the amount of contrails. And again, same flights, very small change to the actual the execution, but actually material change to the impact on climate.
Well, let me come back to all of you, and particularly just given the big canvas that you're all working on, health and education. You know, knowing what you know and you've experienced so far, how would you advise either people in this room with a lot of influence, but even policymakers and others on how to think about these big areas? What would you like to see happen? Maybe starting with you, Anna. If we're going to take advantage of all of
Yeah, it's a very exciting time. I mean, you know, alpha missense was mentioned earlier, and you know, my team pored over that paper just last week, you know, looking at every detail. The promise is incredible. I think all the concerns that we mentioned are there as well. I guess, you know, I would think that, you know, human ingenuity and collaboration is sort of where I would like to end in terms of thinking about the future. I think that, you know, I am trained as a biologist who does actual experiments, you know, in the laboratory, and now we have these incredible tools that can help us accelerate this work and even increase the predictive value of some of the actual causal relationships that we can see in the lab. And so I would say, you know, we're building tools and then we're doing scientific experiments, and if we can just co-develop them together, so, you know, increase dialogue and collaboration between computational scientists and biologists, I think will be the future. And hopefully we can also come up with the ways to safeguard our work and make sure that it's used for good, for humanity, for solving, you know, diseases and bringing answers that are much needed, you know, without sort of taking risks on the other side for humanity. So yeah, I think collaboration and sort of kind of co-development of both the tools and the actual biological experiments that we'll have the tools trained on so that we can actually continue to make progress faster.
I like that a lot. So it's kind of like bold and responsible together.
Yes.
In terms of collaborative.
Co-owners of this
Co-owners
incredible.
of this collective endeavor. Sal, what do you think? I mean, education is one of those areas that has kind of struggled for a long time.
I'd say everyone should engage, start trying to use this stuff. And, you know, every time our team thinks about it for another hour, we realize that we were being too narrow in our thinking. And, you know, I talk about this, a tutor and teaching assistant. These are roles that we already understand, but you very quickly realize that these things can start transcending things that even a regular tutor. We have
what do you mean by that?
Of one, you know, this came from an idea from my daughter where she wanted to talk to a character that she was creating, and so now we have an activity where students can talk to simulations of historical characters. It's not a séance, and they can talk to literary figures. So
you wanted to show that, right?
Yeah, we could show, like, you know, so this is a student wanting to talk to Eeyore the donkey, and hello there, it's me, Eeyore. Not that anyone would notice, but since you're here, what would you like to talk about? Just remember, I'm an AI simulation, so the student asks, why are you so pessimistic? And this is live. Like, if any of your kids are already using Conmigo or you are, you could be doing these types of things. Well now, isn't that a question? I suppose it's just my nature, you see. Some donkeys are born with a sunny disposition, others, well, we see the thistles more than the roses. But what's interesting here is it's not just a call and response, it's actually driving the conversation. So the last question it's asking, now what about you? Do you find yourself more of a Tigger or an Eeyore in your own life? So it can drive a very rich, and every hour we're discovering that there's cooler and cooler things that would look like science fiction a year ago.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Yossi, what would you like to see?
So first, we need to dream bigger, because I think that it's almost the case that if you can dream it, you can possibly solve it. And if we think where we were a couple of years ago in terms of what we could do with AI and technology and where we are today, most experts did not anticipate today. So nobody here can anticipate 2 years, 5 years from now, perhaps except for our colleague Ray Kurzweil, who seems to be able to anticipate a lot. So there are three levels that I think about it. One, many problems that seem impossible could be possible to solve. So we need to actually be bold and responsible in those. Second, there are so many opportunities to actually get everything that we do around us more effectively in climate, in medicine. The example of green light and contrail, and also examples that we have on our work on healthcare, on how to have screening more effectively, how to streamline that. That's another huge benefit for society. And the third one is the equitability. The fact that we can take now education is for everyone. We have ultrasound now in Africa that is enabled by technology that can get into a mobile, and we have partnership with a company. And climate, we actually enable that in places, helping communities that otherwise did not have anything. So if you think about the opportunity for equitability of technology through AI, and the same, MedPalm, Eli mentioned that, enabling breadth of medical knowledge to everywhere around the world in so many different topics. So if you think about a companion or a co-pilot or etc., now every healthcare worker is going to hopefully have some companion who has read all the books in the world and actually passed the the US medical exams in an expert level. So I think the opportunities are pretty amazing.
Well, at that, I think we'll have to wrap it up. I've been told it's time to wrap it up, but I wanted just to thank my panelists here. Thank you. Excited about all the work you're doing, and thank you all for staying.